Today I'm offering a video on Zoom, specifically the top 10 tips for using Zoom in your applications. You might be using it as an instructor here at the college teaching a virtual class. You might be using it for conducting workshops with your staff or community members. In fact, everyone out there right now is using Zoom from every possible function, from teaching to community connections. I know book clubs that have been meeting in the past in person due to coronavirus are now using Zoom to meet virtually. So Zoom has a lot of applications really to our lives outside of maybe what we're doing here at Lake Tahoe Community College. In this overview today, we'll look at the top 10 tips that may get you started in terms of being a better Zoom user. As I've said in a lot of these trainings, you don't have to try to do everything with the technology that you're using. Just use the features in the technology, in this case in Zoom, in the ways that make the most sense for your teaching or work-based approach. So let's look at some of those tips now. All right, everyone. So our first tip today for Zoom is to focus on controlling the noise. One of the things that's great about Zoom is that you can use it to video conference with up to, in some cases, 300 people. So it's a really powerful tool. You can use it to have real-time communication with your staff or your students. That being said, one challenge with using Zoom is controlling the level of participation that is present in any of your Zoom sessions. By controlling, I'm really talking about, in this case, noise and issues of distraction that can come up in Zoom. So really the first thing to do is to think about setting your meetings up in such a way that you will likely want to mute your participants prior to starting. So I can do that in a number of ways. I can go to Settings, and anytime you need to find something, if you just use the Control or Option and then F for Find, you can then type in the word mute in this case, and I can find all the instances under settings of muting. And I say that because the settings in Zoom are really expansive and integrated and of course powerful. So this is what I want to look at right here. Mute participants upon entry. I believe that's the default, or actually since it says modified, it might be not the default. I have it as the default, and if it's default, it's blue. It's active. If it's gray, it's inactive. I have this because I don't necessarily want a lot of noise when I first start a meeting. So this is the first place to control that extraneous noise by going to your settings and muting everybody. Then, when I create a new meeting in Zoom, you will see that it has already populated that setting for me below, right here. Of course, anytime I want to change that, I can do that within the meeting option. I can also mute participants in the meeting option right here without ever having done it under settings. I just like to use settings as a way to preset some of my options for meetings so that I don't have to do it every single time. So that's one really great way to control noise in your meeting. Now there are some other ways to do that as well. You could of course host a webinar. You could control the video, the audio of participants here. You could generate passwords and so forth to not just maybe control noise in your meeting, but also try to control distractions of the sort that we'll talk about under the Zoom bombing focus as well. So just think about this when you run a meeting. The other thing you might remember is as a meeting is active, use all of your screens available to you to mute and unmute participants. And just as a reminder of that, if you're doing a live hosting of a Zoom meeting, you can always click on Manage Participants. You have mute function here. You can always go on as a host in the gallery view and mute particular participants as well. So I think it's a really good tip just to remember that if you're holding a Zoom meeting, while it's great to have a lot of participation and virtual conversations, the noise can also be very distracting to you. The other thing you may want to tell people to do is to make sure they're not running Zoom on two instances. For example, they're running it on a web browser and they're also logged in on a phone or a mobile device or a laptop computer. It can create a feedback loop in the room, and that can also cause additional extraneous noise. So keep this in mind as you work on managing your Zoom meetings. Okay, now this next tip really does relate to the first, and in some ways you'll note that all of these connect together. This tip is to really focus on managing your audience. So by managing your audience, you really want to think about allowing participation of all your virtual participants, but not turning the meeting into chaos, turning into a circus, either because everybody's talking at once or there's a lot of distraction happening visually in the background and so forth. I really do recommend you use the Settings tab on your Zoom and to go in and set things that you want in terms of controlling participant video, participant audio, participant chat, participant screen sharing, and all those features that are great in Zoom, but certainly can get out of hand. So start with your Settings tab and decide if you want participants to show their video. Decide if you want to pre-mute participants, as I talked about in the controlling the noise tip. Once you've done all of that, then you will then hopefully have a better meeting when you actually go to a meeting, schedule it, and then run that meeting. Keep in mind, anytime you schedule a new meeting, you can also go in and adjust some of these parameters. Now, I want to say if you're running a virtual meeting and it's a public meeting, say under the Brown Act, like the LTCC Board of Trustees, you probably have different requirements in terms of managing your audience. You might want to have a password. You might want to have a webinar format such that you are not allowing people to take over in the meeting or to comment or to maybe post inappropriate photos and so forth. So another side of managing the audience is really figuring out what do you want to accomplish for your Zoom meeting or Zoom class, and then make the adjustments on this end through settings, through meetings, such that you can run an effective meeting that allows for effective participation of everyone involved, but doesn't allow things to get out of control and for unnecessary distractions to enter the fray. So another tip here, looking at Zoom as a way of managing your audience. Now, another tip to consider today is the ability to effectively use chat as part of your Zoom workshop or meeting. So as you probably know at this point, there are a number of issues out there that could be potential concerns in terms of someone taking over your meeting or maybe even violation of privacy issues. I was recently holding a workshop with someone who plans to do a lot of group conversations, and I said, because you're dealing with potentially sensitive issues and potentially issues of privacy, you should really consider using chat, including the private functions of chat, to run a more effective meeting or a workshop. So you're probably familiar with the fact that when you start Zoom and you're participating as a participant or running it as a host, you have opportunities to use the chat window. When you click on the chat window, it'll open up and you can type in text questions. One of the nice things is you can type to an individual, a group, or the entire audience. And thus, in terms of privacy issues, you can effectively use chat by making sure that, say, students or clients or coworkers are able to privately interact with you. And during that interaction, they could express to you concerns or answer questions. You could use that opportunity then to pre-screen some things that might come up in the chat room, and then it won't necessarily run into the live video that you're hosting. Keep in mind that unless you uncheck a setting in Zoom under your Settings tab, you will always be able to hide the chat window, your control bar, even while you're doing a screen share like this. So it's a great feature to protect the privacy of participants and to also allow for side conversations that can really help you frame a meeting such that you avoid any embarrassing or unnecessary controversial issues that might come up during the live video meeting. Okay, so our next tip for Zoom is to really understand and take advantage of the power of gallery view in Zoom. So this is from a previous workshop, and as you can see, I'm showing here on my screen all the various gallery views present in Zoom. It's very easy to use this tool. You just go to the top of your screen, and in some cases, depending on your setting, you can actually drag this toolbar around. You might see it in different places, but it's really quite intuitive in terms of the graphics. So if there's a little bit of a bar showing, it's showing you the least information on the screen. So in this case, if the president is talking to us in a webinar, and I click the blue bar here, I will only see this little portion. And that allows me maybe to do some other things on a screen, although we have to be aware of distraction and trying to fully participate in meetings, particularly if we're part of the meeting as a panelist. As you continue to click up, you get more and more items showing for you on the screen. You can also, in some cases, expand this gallery view or change it such that it's showing horizontal. You can click on this icon right here, and then that will allow you to show full screen. You can also choose whether the full screen will say show Jeff DeFranco's image here, or if it's going to show his screen share. So what I recommend is you just experiment. Do a private Zoom session just with yourself. Maybe you could log on with a second device, and then you'll have at least 2 images here. You can then start to click on the various tabs and be able to understand what each of these icons does for you in terms of views. There's also an option where you can pin someone's video. You will always find that in gallery view. I can't show you here since it's not live, but you'll find it by clicking on the profile of the person and click pin video, and that way, for example, if it's an interview or someone who really you want to be the focus of your screen, you could pin that person directly in the screen to see him or her. So another tip here today in terms of using Zoom and getting comfortable with gallery view in Zoom. Our next tip today is to be really aware of some of the privacy issues and Zoom bombing issues that can come up in a Zoom session. So I won't say a lot about this because I do have an additional video on this topic. If you go to ltccteachingandlearning.com, click on COVID-19, please click on Privacy and Virtual Community, Canvas, and Zoom. It's a 30-minute video in which I discuss some concerns related to Zoom bombing, invasions of privacy, FERPA violations, academic freedom, and even the issue of what constitutes a professional environment in terms of setting up a Zoom meeting so that all your participants are not distracted, their backgrounds behind their videos look fairly professional, and you can run a smooth meeting or have an effective classroom virtual environment. So again, a Zoom bomb is the concern that someone might try to come into your meeting and post inappropriate images or try to take over that meeting. Privacy issues related to FERPA, including the issue of not sharing private videos, videos of your class or meetings with the outside world outside of, say, Canvas or Zoom for all of those FERPA privacy issues. And then also just being aware of what is constituting an appropriate work or learning environment in terms of having a Zoom background, in terms of having someone participating in a workshop or a class, such that maybe you're defining a little bit what you want that environment to look like in terms of being appropriate for your purposes. So be aware of the concerns out there related to Zoom bombing, privacy, and the appropriate versus inappropriate work environment. And please watch that additional video to get some insights about tips and how you might manage the Zoom environment to make it a safe and effective one for you and all of your participants. Okay, and our next tip today is to really focus on understanding the power of sharing that can happen in a meeting. So I won't go through all of this, but just to say, under settings, as usual, if you do a search, you can find all the options for sharing. There are quite a few, as you can see, 16 matches in terms of the word share. So this is simply going to set up whether you want to allow both the host and participants to share their screen or content during meetings. So you can decide on that. You can also decide on, do you want the host or the participants to start sharing, and you can also make some options here for screen shares here, whiteboard, and annotation. And when you work on this on your own, keep in mind you always have this share tab here as a host in a meeting. Once you click on that, you will see something like this, clicking on New Share. I always make the tip that when you first start this, even though it might be blue here, defaulted in terms of looks like it's sharing the desktop, it may not actually be doing that. So you always want to click this, even though it might be blued and highlighted here, the first time if you plan to use the desktop screen share option. And what you'll see then is a green background, or rather a green frame that should highlight the entirety of what is being shared during your screen share. So very important to understand that. I've done a few workshops where I thought I was sharing my screen and I wasn't. This would be to share the desktop. This is just the whiteboard. You also have some options with AirPlay, your iPad, iPhone, and then you can do a window by window or app by app sharing. So if I click on this, it's just sharing what's in Safari. If I click on this, it's just PowerPoint and so forth. As you open more applications on your computer, these will populate in this area, and then you can decide if you want to just share by application or share your entire desktop. I like to share the whole desktop, and that way it gives me some opportunities to move windows around and switch apps on the fly. So however you use Share in your Zoom workshops, just be sure to understand how it works. Be sure that you understand that participants have options as well to share their screen. It can be a great environment for collaboration using the shared screens of multiple participants during a Zoom session. So be aware of the settings and use them in ways that will make the most sense for your specific applications. And our next tip here on Zoom is to take advantage of using settings prior to scheduling your next meeting. So as you know, you can go to a meeting, and anytime you schedule that meeting, you can set up the parameters of it here on that menu. But you actually will save yourself a lot of time if you go to your Settings tab and do this in advance. Again, keep in mind if something is indicated by blue on the bar, that means that that is on or active in terms of settings. If it's grayed out, it's not. So my recommendation for you is to go in here and decide on how you want to use Zoom for your particular meetings, your learning opportunities for your students, and to set all of that up ahead of time. Once that's done, and again, you need to decide, it's pretty expansive here in terms of the options, you then go to your meetings, and anytime you schedule a new meeting, those settings, if they're applicable, will be preset. You can always override those for that meeting. The other thing you can do, of course, is anytime in your meetings is save a previous meeting as a template. And that's very easy to do, just here at the bottom. And when you do that, then it allows you to have some things set up for the next meeting, particularly if you're using particular types of meetings in the same way from one event into the next. So another option there is to use templates. But certainly, by all means, go in and establish your settings prior to setting up new events or new meetings here in Zoom. Okay, our next tip on Zoom is a very practical one. It's simply, if you're running a meeting as a host, to breathe a bit and to not focus on overdoing everything in terms of multitasking. So one of the challenges I've discovered with Zoom is that you're doing a lot of things at once. You're probably doing a screen share. You're thinking about your video and audio settings. You're thinking about all of that in terms of your participants and how you're managing them during a meeting. You're also likely looking at the chat room, trying to answer questions there. And then during the meeting, you might be interacting with people via one of the many gallery views, and perhaps people are also raising hands and asking you questions. As a result of all this happening at the same time, in real time, you may sometimes find that you're a bit overwhelmed with trying to manage that all in real time during that meeting. So my advice for you is to think about focusing on the things that really do need to be attended to in terms of your Zoom meeting. Some things, for example, like polling or chat room discussions, you could handle that later. You could deal with chat room questions after the fact and just let people know, whether your students or your coworkers in a meeting, that you will be addressing the chat room questions, but it'll be after the fact because you're trying to focus on managing everything else that's happening during that meeting. So it's just some advice to think about, because certainly when we run a meeting in Zoom, we do have multiple things that we're trying to do at once. So it's just important to really try to relax as best as we can during that meeting and not get overwhelmed by all the management tasks that we have at any given time. Okay, so our next tip focuses on using Zoom in ways in which you think about the balance between participation and control. If you watch my workshop I did on privacy, FERPA, and issues related to Zoom bombing, I presented this chart to you, and I think it's pretty instructive because you can do a lot in Zoom in terms of promoting democratic forms of communication and what we call interactivity. So in other words, you're doing live video sharing, you're participating, you're communicating, you're debating, you're having conversations. And that's important whether we're teaching a class to our students or running a meeting on campus. That being said, we realize that in some cases things come up. People sometimes do inappropriate things in these settings. In terms of Zoom bombing, we also have to be aware of privacy issues and not sharing information about students with the outside world. So there's always a balance between that sense of interaction and democratic communication and safety and security, policing content and behavior. So as I've said in quite a few of these tips, I really do recommend going to your main Zoom profile and actually clicking on your settings and deciding ahead of time how you want to balance control and the desire to not give participants too much control such that a meeting or a classroom can get out of hand, but also then promoting that sense of communication and participation that's very important in a traditional classroom setting where we're not teaching virtually, as well as in a traditional meeting where we're not having meetings in virtual settings. So go in and set these up ahead of time in your settings. Also then, when you create a new meeting, think about how you want to offer participation to your participants and also how you might want to balance any of that participation with restrictions that you set up ahead of time such that you can manage a meeting effectively and control participants so that things do not get out of control. Okay, and my last tip for you today is to focus on extras if and when you need them. So extras include things like recordings. If you have your Zoom set up, which is accessible on settings and also on meetings, and you can do this live when you start a meeting as far as starting or stopping a recording. But if you'd like recordings of any meetings, then you have that opportunity to have those files available. Zoom will prepare for you everything including a video file, audio transcript, a text transcript of the chat file, and then you can download and use that later. There are also analytics available to you. And those same analytics, or really different ones, can be found under your Reports tab. Reports will have information about meetings, participants, duration of the meeting, and so forth. And it can be very handy to have this information available, perhaps for tracking attendance or for other purposes. A lot of this is exportable as a CSV file into Excel or Numbers or any of your favorite spreadsheet programs. So there's a lot in terms of extras in Zoom that you can use. Things like your personal meeting ID, very handy to have that. You could use it as office hours. You could use it as an instant meeting with a colleague and so forth. Anytime you need more information, there's a lot more available, both on my tutorials on my website and also through some of the video tutorials, the knowledge base, and additional information available through Zoom, which is a company that definitely does support its users and has a lot of options in terms of getting help and so forth. So my tip for you is to use these extras as you need them, but as usual with any technology you're using here in this new era of adapting to COVID-19, both for teaching, learning, and for meetings, to really think about what's practical and authentic for you and to not try to overdo it in terms of any of the extras. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed our focus today here on using Zoom in terms of our top 10 tips. These are by no means all of the tips out there that you can take advantage of. In fact, if you go to my website, ltccteachingandlearning.com, I encourage you to click on the COVID-19 tab at the top, and you will find a slew of resources related to Zoom and many other areas. In fact, if you look at the section at the top here under Prep Videos, you will see there's a video taking you through the ins and outs of Zoom. There's another video, a workshop on how to use all sorts of video in your class or work applications, including asynchronous video through the app that I'm using right now to record this workshop, which is Canvas Studio. Also down below, you'll find, I think, a very useful video on privacy and virtual community. issues of Zoom bombing and how to prevent yourself from falling victim to some of those forms of cyber attacks. And then also for faculty members, I encourage you to look at the office hour options in Canvas, including Zoom integration through Confer Now. So a really great opportunity to look at some of the opportunities out there to really hone in our craft here in terms of Zoom or other technology that we might be using in our work environment or in our virtual teaching. And down below the page you'll find additional videos, additional readings, including a lot of information about Zoom and Canvas. So by all means, take advantage of these resources. Do some crowdsourcing on your own, connect with fellow faculty members and staff in your area or department or workplace, and share the knowledge a bit so that we can all become better experts at Zoom and the other virtual technology we're using here at Lake Tahoe Community College. So good luck, and I'll be back in the future with additional workshops and videos like this.